On the Christian calendar, Easter is not just a day, it's 50 days, a whole season in which to celebrate the resurrection of our Lord Jesus Christ. So on these Sundays after Easter Sunday, we often talk about those times Jesus appeared to his disciples, when he presented himself alive to them by many convincing proofs, as Luke puts it. But there is something unusual about those resurrection appearances, isn't there? Have you noticed how people often do not recognize Jesus immediately? Even those people who were with him for years. Only in this passage from this morning's gospel reading, there's Jesus standing on the beach. He calls out to his disciples. He asks them if they've caught any fish. They say no. He says, cast your nets on the other side. They do. It's only as they are hauling in that miraculous catch that the beloved disciple says, it's the Lord. Only then. And even later, as they are standing there having breakfast with Jesus, John tells us that none of the disciples dared to ask him, who are you? Because they all knew it was the Lord. Why would he even think to mention it unless there was something different about Jesus? I wonder what it was. Did he look different? Did he sound different? Had the experience of death and resurrection altered him that much? Think about it. In the oldest and best versions of Mark's gospel, we don't even have a resurrection account. A young man in a white robe appears to some women who come to the tomb. He tells them that Jesus will meet the disciples in Galilee. He tells them to go and tell everybody, but they don't tell anybody because they are so afraid. They simply flee from the tomb. In Matthew's gospel, we are told that the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain to which Jesus had directed them. When they saw him, they worshiped him, but some doubted. They doubted? Doubted what? Doubted the resurrection? In Luke's gospel, we have that strange story about those two disciples walking along the road to Emmaus with Jesus for 7 miles without seeing him for who he is. And when he appears in the upper room later, he has to show the disciples his hands and his feet. He invites them to handle him so that they can see he is flesh and bone and not a ghost. Luke covers their doubt by saying they disbelieved for joy. In other words, it was just too good to be true. Nevertheless, they couldn't believe it. And then in John, of course, Mary Magdalene doesn't recognize Jesus right away. She thinks he is the gardener. In the upper room, he shows the disciples his hands and his side as evidence that it is he and no other. And then in this story, only the beloved disciple begins to figure out that there is something strangely familiar about the stranger on the seashore. All of this leads me to believe that the Jesus who rose from the dead was different from the Jesus who died. I don't mean that he was a different person. I mean that his appearance was different. He didn't look like he did before. Or maybe he did. I've often wondered what it would be like if I were standing here looking out over the congregation and saw someone whose funeral I had conducted the week before. Don't you think I would stare at that person and say to myself, wow, that sure does look a lot like Mrs. So-and-so, but it couldn't be Mrs. So-and-so because she died. I wonder if it was the same for the disciples, especially those two on the road to Emmaus. Were they saying to each other the whole time, that sure does look a lot like Jesus? But it couldn't be. We watched him die. I've heard about studies where people can be looking right at something but not see it because they're looking for something else. And once I attended a lecture where a short video was presented, and I was asked to count the number of times the team in white passed the ball back and forth to each other. I watched. I counted 15 times. At the end of the video, the lecturer said, "Did you see the gorilla?" Excuse me? He backed up the video and showed it again, and sure enough, a man in a gorilla costume walked right through the middle of that group, stopped in the middle, turned toward the camera, and beat on its chest. I hadn't seen it. So it's possible that the disciples have trouble recognizing Jesus simply because they weren't looking for him or because they couldn't believe what they were seeing. Now, you would think that they would have anticipated the resurrection a little better than they did. That when Jesus told them, "Look, I'm going to die, but on the third day I'll rise again," they would have been watching for him. And when he showed up, they would say, "Oh, there you are." But that's not what they say. It's not what happened at all. And it makes me wonder, was it more than that? Did Jesus look different? Was it even more than that? Was he actually different? In that story about the Emmaus Road, he vanishes from the disciples' sight as soon as they recognize him. In that upper room, the disciples are together with the doors locked because they are so afraid. Jesus suddenly appears in their midst as if he had walked through locked doors. And the last time his disciples see him, Jesus ascends into heaven on a cloud. These are not normal human activities. It makes me think that his resurrection body was different in significant ways from his earthly body.